Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into the mist-shrouded highlands of medieval Ethiopia, where the air tastes like frankincense and danger, and you're about to discover why brewing coffee for royalty was basically a full-contact sport with a mortality rate that would make modern baristas quit on the spot. Picture this. You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of Emperor Yakuno Amlok's compound in 1270 AD. Your hands trembling, not from the mountain cold, but because if you mess up today's coffee ceremony, you probably won't survive to see tomorrow's sunrise. And I'm not being dramatic here. That's just Tuesday in the Ethiopian royal court. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how we're all connected across time zones, especially during these late night history sessions. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The compound's stone walls loom around you like sleeping giants, their surfaces still radiating yesterday's heat while the morning air bites at your exposed skin. You're not alone. Dozens of servants move through the shadows with practiced silence, each knowing their role in the elaborate dance that's about to begin. Your particular job? You're apprenticed to the Buna Abat, the coffee father, whose position in court ranks somewhere between royal physician and potential assassination target. The old man's weathered hands shake slightly as he lights the ceremonial brazier, though you can't tell if it's from age or the very real understanding that 3 coffee fathers before him met unfortunate ends involving tasting accidents. You watch him arrange the tools of his trade, the washing basin made from hippopotamus ivory, because regular materials just won't do for royal beans. The roasting pan hammered from metal that supposedly came from Solomon's mines, and most importantly, the selection of green coffee beans that arrived yesterday under armed guard. These aren't just any beans, they're from the sacred groves of Kaffa, where local tradition claims the goats first discovered coffee by dancing like they'd invented disco about 7 centuries too early. Historians still argue whether the dancing goat story is pure mythology or based on actual observations of caffeinated livestock, but frankly, you've seen stranger things in this court. The Buna Abat motions for you to begin the washing ritual, and this is where things get interesting. You can't just rinse these beans under any old water. Oh no, this is water blessed by 7 priests, collected during the full moon, and stored in jars that have never touched the ground. One tiny deviation from protocol and the court's network of spies will ensure everyone knows about it before the sun fully rises. The mainstream historical fact that nobody talks about? Medieval Ethiopian coffee preparation took an average of 4 hours from start to finish, making your local cafe's pour-over seem like fast food. But here's the quirky detail. The washing water couldn't be discarded normally. It had to be poured into a special garden where only medicinal plants grew, because they believed coffee-touched water had healing properties that modern science is only now starting to investigate. As you carefully wash each bean, removing any that show the slightest imperfection, you hear the first stirrings from the royal quarters. The emperor will expect his coffee precisely at sunrise, timed to the moment when the first light touches the palace's highest tower. You glance nervously at the Buna Abbat, who's now sorting through the spice collection with the intensity of a bomb defusal expert. Each spice has its own story, its own danger. Use too much tejisar, Ethiopian black cardamom, and the coffee becomes bitter enough to insult the royal palate. Too little kefli, cinnamon, and you've basically announced that the emperor isn't worth the expensive imports. The balance has to be perfect, and perfect is a moving target that changes with the emperor's mood, the season, and whatever political drama happened to unfold at last night's feast. The sun hasn't even thought about rising yet, but you're already following the Buna Abbat through the palace gates, joining a procession that looks more like a military expedition than a coffee run. 20 armed guards surround your small group, their spears glinting in the torchlight, because apparently in medieval Ethiopia, coffee procurement requires the same security protocol as moving the crown jewels. You're heading to the wild coffee forests of Kaffa, a 3-day journey that'll take you through territories where the trees themselves are considered holy, and the monks who guard them are scarier than the bandits who'd love to steal your cargo. Your mule stumbles on the rocky path, and you grip the saddle tighter, wondering not for the first time why anyone thought putting coffee trees on mountainsides, accessible only by death-defying goat tracks, was a good idea. The guard next to you chuckles at your white knuckles. "First pilgrimage?" he asks, and you nod, trying not to look at the sheer drop to your left, where morning mist hides a valley floor that's claimed more than a few coffee seekers. He tells you about his uncle, who made this journey 43 times until one day he sneezed at the wrong moment, and, well, let's just say the family held a very closed casket funeral. By midday, you reach the first checkpoint, a monastery perched impossibly on a cliff face like someone decided architecture should be an extreme sport. The monks here don't just pray, they're the gatekeepers of coffee knowledge, maintaining detailed records of which trees produce beans worthy of royalty and which are relegated to common folk who apparently have less discerning palates. The head monk emerges, and you swear his beard alone could win a wrestling match. He examines your royal seal with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for detecting counterfeit money, running his fingers over the wax impression while muttering prayers that sound suspiciously like threats. "The trees are speaking this year," he announces cryptically, which you learn means the coffee harvest is exceptional, though historians still argue whether medieval Ethiopian monks actually believed trees could communicate, or if this was elaborate code for market pricing. The monk leads your group along paths that definitely aren't on any map, through forests so dense the canopy blocks out the sky entirely. You're walking through a green twilight where every sound makes you jump, partly because of the leopards everyone keeps casually mentioning, and partly because touching the wrong tree here is apparently punishable by curses that last 7 generations. Finally, you arrive at the mother trees, and honestly, they're disappointing at first glance. Gnarled, ancient things that look like they're held together by pure stubbornness and possibly magic, but the monks treat them with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics, which makes sense when you learn these specific trees have been producing coffee for the royal family for over 300 years. The harvesting process is insane. Only cherries from the eastern-facing branches can be picked for the emperor, and they have to be perfectly ripe, not a day early, not a day late. You watch monks scaling these trees with the agility of caffeinated squirrels, selectively plucking cherries while chanting in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language that makes everything sound like you're summoning something. Here's a quirky tidbit that'll blow your mind. The monks insist on harvesting during specific lunar phases, claiming the moon's position affects the coffee's flavor profile. Modern biodynamic farmers would totally get this, but in medieval times, timing your harvest by celestial bodies while dodging actual leopards was next level dedication. You're assigned to work with Brother Tekla, who's been picking coffee for 40 years and has opinions about everything. He shows you how to identify the perfect cherry by color, firmness, and, this is where it gets weird, by listening to it. Apparently, ripe cherries make a different sound when you shake the branch, though you suspect Brother Tekla might just be messing with the new guy. The mainstream historical record confirms that Ethiopian coffee cultivation predates anywhere else by centuries. But what they don't tell you is that each tree had its own name and personality according to the monks. You're currently picking from Bitter Miriam, who apparently produces beans with notes of chocolate and mild existential dread. Brother Tekla warns you not to mix Bitter Miriam's cherries with those from Sweetness of Solomon, 3 trees over, because the flavor combination once caused an emperor to exile his entire coffee preparation staff to the desert. Whether that's true or just monastic humor, you're not taking any chances. As the day wears on, your basket slowly fills with precious cherries, each one representing about 15 minutes of life-threatening tree climbing. The monks maintain strict quotas, exactly 7 baskets from each designated tree, no more, no less. You ask why 7, and Brother Tekla launches into an explanation involving biblical numerology, astronomical observations, and the digestive habits of the sacred ibis that makes you wonder if anyone in medieval Ethiopia ever gave a straight answer to anything. Your fingers are stained purple-black from 3 days of cherry sorting, and you're starting to understand why the royal coffee processors develop a 1,000-yard stare by age 30. Back at the palace compound, you're in what they call the separation chambers, which sounds ominous and is exactly as tedious as you feared. The cherries from your Highland adventure must now be processed with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make modern quality control inspectors weep with joy. You're sitting cross-legged on a reed mat, surrounded by baskets of cherries that need to be sorted into 5 different quality grades. And Brother Tekla's warning echoes in your head. Mix up the grades, and you'll be testing the emperor's famous forgiveness, which historians note was about as reliable as Ethiopian weather patterns. The head processor, a woman named Almaz, whose name ironically means diamond, despite her personality being more like granite, demonstrates the proper technique. Each cherry gets the full inspection, rolled between thumb and forefinger to check for firmness, held up to the light streaming through the narrow windows to examine color consistency, and, this is where it gets properly medieval, sniffed for any hint of fermentation that might indicate spiritual contamination. Yeah, you heard that right. Apparently, evil spirits really enjoy hanging out in subpar coffee cherries, which is definitely something Starbucks doesn't warn you about. You learn that processing happens in 3 stages, each more paranoia inducing than the last. First comes the floating test, where cherries are dumped into massive clay vessels filled with blessed water. The ones that float are immediately rejected and burned, not composted, burned, because floating indicates either insect damage or demonic possession. And honestly, in this job market, you don't question which one they're more worried about. The sinkers get fished out and spread on raised beds made from woven grass that's been smoked with frankincense for purification. The mainstream historical fact here is that Ethiopians invented the washed process for coffee centuries before anyone else. But the quirky detail nobody mentions is that the washing water had to come from 7 different sources, mixed in proportions that changed based on which saint's day it was. The drying process is where things get properly intense. These aren't just any drying beds. They're positioned according to ancient architectural principles that supposedly align with celestial movements. You spend hours turning the cherries exactly 1/4 rotation every time the shadow of the palace sundial moves 1 mark. Turn them too often, and you're disturbing their spiritual development. Not often enough, and you risk uneven drying that creates what Almaz calls confusion in the bean's soul. You're pretty sure she's being metaphorical, but then again, you've seen her have full conversations with individual coffee beans, so who knows? What really gets you is the color coding system. As the cherries dry, they gradually change from deep red to various shades of brown, and each shade has its own destiny. The deepest mahogany browns are reserved for the emperor's morning cup. Lighter browns go to the royal family. Anything with even a hint of gray gets relegated to the court musicians, who apparently have less discriminating palates or maybe just need stronger coffee to deal with playing the same ceremonial songs every blessed morning. You develop a weird talent for distinguishing between 17 different shades of brown, a skill that's probably useless in any other career but might save your life here. The real drama happens during the peeling phase. Once dried to perfection, each cherry must have its outer skin removed, but not by machine. Oh no, this is medieval Ethiopia where everything is personal. You use a small stone tool that's been passed down through generations of processors, its surface worn smooth by thousands of hands before yours. The technique requires just enough pressure to crack the dried skin without damaging the precious bean inside. Too gentle, and you're there all day. Too firm, and you've just destroyed beans worth more than your annual salary. Almaz hovers behind you, occasionally making disapproving clicks with her tongue that sound like aggressive crickets and definitely don't help your concentration. Here's where historians still argue. The beans that emerge from this process are sometimes greenish, sometimes more yellow, and the color apparently matters enormously. The green ones are considered alive and full of potential. The yellower ones are sleeping and need special awakening rituals before roasting. You're tasked with sorting them by color variations so subtle you need to work by direct sunlight, which means your productive hours are limited to maybe 4 hours a day when the light angles just right through the processing room's strategically placed windows. The rest of the time, you're cleaning equipment with the kind of obsessive detail that would make modern germaphobes look relaxed. By the end of your first week in processing, you understand why coffee in medieval Ethiopia was precious enough to warrant its own dedicated wing of the palace. Each bean that makes it through this gauntlet represents hours of labor, careful selection, and enough quality control to make modern ISO standards look casual. You're handling maybe a few pounds of processed beans per day, and that's considered good productivity. Almaz finally nods approvingly at your work, which from her is like receiving a Nobel Prize. Tomorrow, these beans move to the Spice Master, and you're both excited and terrified to see what fresh insanity that will bring. The Spice Master's workshop hits you like a physical force, a wall of scents so complex your nose basically files for bankruptcy and gives up trying to identify individual aromas. You're following Almaz down a corridor that definitely wasn't on the palace tour, through a door hidden behind a tapestry depicting St. George definitely not slaying a dragon that looks suspiciously like it's been drinking coffee. Inside, the royal spice master, a man named Tades, who wears enough jewelry to fund a small army, presides over shelves lined with jars that probably contain more wealth than most Ethiopian villages see in a lifetime. Touch nothing, Tadessa warns, and the way he says it makes you wonder if the last apprentice who got grabby is now part of one of those mysterious spice blends. The workshop is organized with the kind of precise chaos that only makes sense to its creator, cinnamon bark from Ceylon stacked next to mysterious dried berries from Punt, black cardamom pods the size of your thumb nestled beside tiny seeds that Tadesse claims come from beyond the land where the sun sleeps, which could mean India or could mean he's having a laugh at your expense. You watch him prepare the emperor's personal blend, and it's like watching a very expensive, very dangerous chemistry experiment. He starts with Tejsar, the Ethiopian black cardamom that's nothing like the green stuff you might know. This one tastes like campfire smoke had a baby with pepper and raised it in a cave full of bats. The amount he adds is measured not by weight, but by counting individual pods while whispering what sound like either prayers or threats in a dialect you don't recognize. Next comes the cinnamon, but not just any cinnamon. This is from specific trees in Ceylon that are allegedly watered with elephant tears, though historians still argue whether that's metaphorical or if someone actually made elephants cry for coffee flavoring. Here's the mainstream historical tidbit that'll blow your mind. Medieval Ethiopian coffee wasn't just coffee with spices thrown in. It was a carefully crafted medicinal beverage where each ingredient served a specific purpose. The cinnamon fought off evil spirits and stomach demons, which we now call bacteria, but honestly, stomach demons sounds cooler. The cardamom opened spiritual channels and also happened to help with digestion. But here's the quirky detail. Tades adds something he calls virgin salt, which has to be harvested from the Danakil Depression by monks who've never looked upon a woman. You're 90% sure this is just regular salt with fancy marketing, but the one time someone used regular salt, The emperor got a mysterious rash, so now everyone's too scared to risk it. The grinding process is where things get properly ritualistic. Tadesse produces a mortar and pestle made from black stone that he claims fell from the sky. Meteorite or volcanic rock. You can't tell, but it's definitely older than anyone you know. Each spice gets ground separately, in a specific order, with specific movements, clockwise for protective spices, counterclockwise for those that open the mind, and a weird figure-8 pattern for the ones that speak to ancestors. You're tasked with grinding the long pepper, a spice that looks like tiny black catkins and smells like regular pepper's more interesting cousin who traveled the world and came back with stories. What really makes you nervous is the secret ingredients section. Tadesse has a locked cabinet that requires 3 different keys, and inside are jars with labels written in code. He selects one, seemingly at random, though you notice he counts shelf positions under his breath first. From it, he extracts exactly 3 drops of something that smells like flowers having an argument with leather. This, he explains, is the Emperor's personal addition, a tincture made from plants that grow only in the royal garden, pollinated only by specific bees, harvested only during eclipses. Is it psychoactive? Probably. Is asking about it a good way to end up testing tomorrow's coffee for poison? Definitely. The blending process requires the kind of precision that makes watchmaking look casual. Tadesse layers the ground spices in a special vessel, each layer separated by whisper-thin sheets of gold leaf that will dissolve into the coffee. Why gold? Because the Emperor's coffee needs to literally contain treasure, and also because gold supposedly has properties that enhance the other flavors. Historians still argue whether this was early molecular gastronomy or just showing off. But when you're the emperor, the line between those things gets pretty blurry. The final blend smells like Christmas, decided to take a gap year in Africa, and came back with some seriously interesting stories. You spend the rest of the day learning the different blends for different occasions. There's the morning blend, heavy on the ginger to wake the soul. The afternoon blend, more floral, to encourage contemplation. And the nighttime blend that contains ingredients Tadesse won't even name out loud. Each blend has its own storage container, its own special spoon for measuring, and its own set of prayers that must be recited during preparation. You're starting to understand why being a coffee preparer in medieval Ethiopia required the kind of training usually reserved for priests or assassins, sometimes both. The roasting chamber is essentially a stone room designed by someone who thought ventilation was for weaklings and that breathing clear air was overrated. You're coughing within seconds of entering, your eyes streaming as smoke from 3 active roasting sessions fills the space with an aroma that's simultaneously heavenly and hellish. The master roaster, an ancient woman named Sibyl, who looks like she's been personally roasting coffee since the Queen of Sheba's time, doesn't even blink as she tends to her fires with the casual confidence of someone who's probably fireproof by now. Virgin fire only, she croaks at you, pointing to a separate hearth where you'll be starting your own roasting fire from scratch. And when she says virgin fire, she means it. This flame can't be borrowed from existing fires, can't be lit from yesterday's coals, and definitely can't be started with anything as pedestrian as flint and steel. No, you need to use the sacred fire bow, a device that requires the upper body strength of an ox and the patience of a saint. You spend 20 minutes grinding wood against wood while Siebel watches with the expression of someone enjoying your suffering immensely, occasionally offering helpful advice like faster and you're doing it wrong without explaining what right would look like. When you finally get a spark and then nurse that spark into an actual flame while sweating like you've run from here to Cairo, Siebel nods approvingly and shows you the wood selection. Because of course it's not just any wood. Royal coffee requires charcoal from specific acacia trees that have been blessed by priests, struck by lightning at least once for that divine spark, and aged for exactly 7 months. The mainstream historical record mentions that Ethiopian coffee roasting was an art form, but they leave out the part where each type of wood imparts different flavors and spiritual properties. Want your coffee to promote wisdom? Use wood from trees where owls nest. Need courage? Better find some wood from a tree that survived a lion scratching post phase. The actual roasting process is where things get properly medieval. Siebel demonstrates with a batch of the mid-grade beans. She wouldn't trust you with the emperor's beans if you were the last roaster in Ethiopia. She uses a pan that's been in service for over a century, its surface seasoned with the oils of literally millions of beans. The pan never gets washed, only wiped with a cloth made from banana fibers, because soap would apparently insult the accumulated flavors of generations. She moves the pan in patterns that look random, but definitely aren't, creating swirls and spirals that ensure each bean gets evenly exposed to heat, while she mutters what sounds like either mathematical calculations or ancient curses. Listen, she commands, and at first you think she's going senile, but then you hear it. The beans actually make different sounds as they roast. First crack sounds like distant popcorn. Second crack is more like tiny firecrackers. But Siebel hears nuances you can't. She claims to identify individual beans, calling out when they're ready. Though historians still argue whether medieval roasters actually had superhuman hearing or just really good marketing instincts. She stops the roast at a precise moment that seems arbitrary to you but makes her nod with satisfaction, then pours the beans onto a woven cooling tray in one smooth motion that speaks of decades of practice. Your turn comes with the lowest grade beans, the ones destined for palace guards who apparently have taste buds of leather. Even so, the pressure is intense. Too light a roast and the coffee tastes like grass had an unfortunate encounter with hot water. Too dark and you've created expensive charcoal. The sweet spot, what Siebel calls the moment of truth, lasts about 10 seconds, and missing it means starting over with fresh beans and fresh virgin fire, because obviously reusing fire for a second batch would be cheating the cosmic coffee forces. Here's the quirky detail that'll mess with your head. Different roasts are required for different times of day, based on the belief that the sun's position affects how beans absorb heat. Morning roasts must be lighter to match the gentle sunrise. Afternoon roasts go darker to echo the sun's full strength. And then midnight roasts, yes, they roast coffee at midnight for special ceremonies, require counting the seconds between lightning flashes during storms to determine the exact roasting duration. You're pretty sure this is more superstition than science. But then Siebel shows you two batches roasted from the same beans at different times, and damn if they don't taste completely different. The prayers during roasting are non-negotiable. Each stage has its own incantation, starting with the blessing of the green beans. May your potential awaken. Through first crack, your true nature emerges. To the final cooling, rest now in preparation for glory. Siebel makes you memorize these in Ge'ez, Amharic, and what she claims is the language of coffee itself, which sounds suspiciously like she's just making phonetic sounds. But you're not about to question someone who controls whether you get to keep your eyebrows in this smoke-filled inferno. By the end of your first full roasting session, you've produced something that might charitably be called coffee, though Siebel's expression suggests it's more suitable for repelling invaders than drinking. The grinding hall makes your ears want to file a formal complaint with whatever cosmic HR department handles sensory assault. Dozens of massive basalt mortars and pestles create a rhythmic thunder that penetrates your skull and somehow manages to be both hypnotic and migraine-inducing. You're standing before your assigned grinding station, a mortar so large you could take a bath in it, paired with a pestle that requires both hands and most of your upper body strength just to lift. The master grinder, a man built like someone crossbred a bull with a particularly aggressive mountain, demonstrates the proper technique with movements that turn coffee grinding into something between percussion performance and spiritual warfare. The rhythm is everything. He bellows over the noise, showing you how each downward strike must land at precisely the right angle to crack the beans without pulverizing them into dust. The mainstream historical record will tell you that Ethiopians were grinding coffee for centuries before anyone else figured out burr grinders. But what they don't mention is that royal coffee grinding was basically a martial art with beans. You need to achieve exactly 17 different particle sizes in each batch, from chunks the size of peppercorns down to powder fine enough to disappear on your tongue, because apparently the emperor's palate can detect improper particle distribution from 3 rooms away. Your first attempts are pathetic. You either create coffee dust that could double as face powder, or chunks that look like you just threw whole beans in a cup and called it a day. The master grinder watches with the pained expression of someone witnessing a crime against nature. He adjusts your grip, corrects your stance, and makes you practice the basic striking pattern on a mortar filled with dried chickpeas because, and this is a direct quote, "You're not ready for real beans yet." The humiliation burns almost as much as your biceps after 20 minutes of chickpea demolition. What really gets you is the singing. Yes, singing. Each grinding session requires specific work songs that supposedly help maintain rhythm while also blessing the coffee with protective vibrations. The other grinders belt out these songs with enthusiasm that suggests either genuine religious fervor or the kind of Stockholm syndrome that develops when you've been grinding coffee for decades. You mumble along, trying to learn lyrics that seem to change verses every time someone feels creative. The quirky historical detail nobody mentions. These songs contained coded messages about the coffee's quality and destination. Certain verses warned if beans were substandard. Others indicated which batch was meant for which royal family member, all hidden in metaphors about shepherds and rivers that would make modern cryptographers weep with respect. The actual grinding technique involves what can only be described as coffee choreography. Strike, twist, lift, breathe, strike again, in patterns that create specific textures for different brewing methods. The emperor's morning coffee needs what they call sand and pebbles, mostly fine with strategic larger pieces that slow water flow and create complexity. His afternoon coffee requires silk and surprises, powder so fine it's almost liquid, with random larger chunks that release flavor at unexpected moments. You spend hours learning to create these textures while your arms scream for mercy and your lower back files formal protests with every twist. Here's where it gets properly insane. Each batch must be ground with beans from a single tree, and you need to adjust your technique based on that tree's personality. Remember Bitter Miriam from the harvest? Her beans require aggressive grinding with counterclockwise twists to unlock her sweetness beneath the bitterness. Sweetness of Solomon needs gentle coaxing with clockwise motions and occasional pauses to let the beans rest and remember their purpose. You're 90% sure this is hazing, but then you taste coffee ground different ways from the same beans, and holy hell, there's actually a difference. Maybe it's the power of suggestion, or maybe medieval Ethiopians were onto something about particle dynamics that modern science is still catching up to. The quality control process makes earlier stages look relaxed. The master grinder samples your work by rubbing ground coffee between his fingers, letting it fall from specific heights to observe how it drifts, and, this is the weird part, listening to it. Apparently, properly ground coffee makes a different sound when poured than badly ground coffee. He demonstrates, and you can actually hear it. Good grounds whisper, bad grounds rasp. Whether this is real acoustic science or collective delusion, you're too tired to care. You just adjust your technique until your coffee whispers sweet nothings instead of screaming obscenities. By the end of your first week, you can maintain the rhythm for a full grinding session without your arms falling off, though they seriously consider it. You've learned 15 different grinding patterns, memorized songs in 3 languages plus coffee speak, and developed calluses in places you didn't know could get calluses. The master grinder finally allows you to work on beans destined for minor nobility, not the emperor yet, but at least people who matter enough to complain if their coffee tastes like disappointment. You're moving up in the world, one precisely ground particle at a time, even if your shoulders will never forgive you for this career choice. The clay vessel workshop exists in its own microclimate of earth and fire, where potters work with the focused intensity of surgeons and the superstitious paranoia of people who know their products will hold liquids destined for royal consumption. You're immediately handed a lump of clay and told to feel its intentions, which sounds like New Age nonsense until the master potter, a woman named Burke, whose hands look like they could strangle a lion, demonstrates how different clays actually do behave, like they have personalities. This piece wants to be a water jug. That one dreams of becoming a coffee pot, and the one you're holding apparently wants to return to the earth as quickly as possible based on how it crumbles at your touch. The clay for royal coffee vessels isn't just any mud. It comes from specific spots along the Blue Nile where the soil has been seasoned by centuries of floods and blessed by crocodile tears. So, you're tasked with processing raw clay, which means removing impurities like stones, organic matter, and what Burke mysteriously refers to as memories that don't belong. The mainstream historical fact is that Ethiopian pottery traditions date back millennia, but the quirky detail is that coffee pots required clay mixed with ground coffee beans from previous failed batches, creating a weird recursive loop where bad coffee became part of the vessels meant to hold good coffee. It's recycling with existential implications. You learn that royal coffee vessels come in three distinct categories, each with its own production requirements that would make modern ISO standards look like gentle suggestions. First, the jabina, the classic Ethiopian coffee pot with its round bottom and long neck that looks like someone gave a sphere ambitious ideas about becoming a swan. These must be formed in complete silence, because apparently the clay can hear your thoughts while it's wet, and negative thinking creates microfractures that will make the coffee taste of regret. Second, the cooling vessels, wide, shallow dishes where roasted beans rest while prayers are recited. These need perfect balance so they can be spun during the cooling process without sending precious beans flying across the room like caffeinated projectiles. Third, the serving cups, which must be small enough to ensure the coffee stays hot, but large enough to show respect for the drinker's status. Get the proportions wrong, and you've either insulted someone's rank or suggested they have the bladder capacity of a small bird. The shaping process requires a pottery wheel that's powered by an apprentice, currently you, who must maintain exactly the right speed while the master works. Too fast, and the clay flies off like it's auditioning for a catapult. Too slow, and the vessel walls develop inconsistencies that will make the coffee flow unevenly, creating what Burke calls confusion in the pour. You spend hours pedaling while she shapes vessels with movements so precise they look like meditation in fast forward. Your legs burn, sweat drips into your eyes, and you're pretty sure you're developing thigh muscles that could crack walnuts. All while Burke calmly explains that each vessel must be shaped during specific hours when the Earth's breathing is most favorable. Here's where historians still argue. The decorative elements on royal coffee vessels weren't just aesthetic, they were functional channels that supposedly directed the flow of coffee in ways that enhanced flavor. The raised bumps around the rim, they create microturbulence that aerates the coffee. The carved spirals down the handle, they channel heat away from the holder's hand while maintaining the coffee's temperature through some principle that sounds like medieval thermodynamics. The geometric patterns on the base, they're actually a coded system indicating which vessel belongs to which brewing master when it was made, and what types of coffee it's certified to hold. You try carving your first pattern and create something that looks like a drunk spider tried to write its autobiography in clay. The firing process is where things get properly mystical. Vessels can't just be dried and fired like common pottery. Oh no, they need to undergo a ritual that makes Catholic Mass look casual. First, they're dried in a special chamber where frankincense smoke supposedly drives out any evil spirits that might have snuck into the clay during forming. Then they're arranged in the kiln according to celestial alignments, because apparently the position of Venus affects how clay molecules bond during firing. The temperature must rise and fall in patterns that mirror the rhythm of traditional coffee grinding songs, which means someone, guess who, has to tend the fire while basically conducting an orchestra of flames. You watch Burke remove finished vessels from the kiln with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. Each one gets tested with a series of bizarre quality checks, ringing it like a bell to hear if it sings true, pouring water to observe flow patterns, and even having a designated taster sip plain hot water from it to detect in any clay flavors that might contaminate future coffee. The rejects get smashed, not discarded, smashed, with their fragments ground up to become temper for the next batch of clay. It's the circle of life, pottery edition, where today's failures become tomorrow's foundation. Your first successful vessel is a lopsided cup that looks like it's having an existential crisis, but it holds liquid without leaking and doesn't taste like dirt. So Burke declares it adequate for guards' coffee, which from her is practically a Nobel Prize. The tension in the tasting chamber could be cut with one of those ceremonial coffee spoons, and trust me, everyone's gripping theirs like tiny weapons right now. You're watching the royal taster, a man named Getachew, whose job title might as well be Professional Poison Detector, prepare for the morning's most dangerous performance. The first pour of any new batch requires what amounts to voluntary Russian roulette with caffeine, and Getachew's survived 15 years in this position, which makes him either incredibly lucky or possibly immortal. He's examining today's brew with the kind of intensity usually reserved for diffusing bombs, because in medieval Ethiopian courts, sometimes that's exactly what bad coffee turned out to be. The tasting ritual begins with Getachew examining the coffee's color by holding it up to a beam of sunlight filtered through a yellow glass window. Apparently, regular light isn't good enough for royal coffee inspection. He swirls the cup in patterns that look random, but definitely aren't, watching how the liquid clings to the sides, reading fortunes in the coffee residue like some caffeinated oracle. The mainstream historical record mentions that royal tasters existed, but they leave out the part where these guys developed taste buds so sensitive they could detect a single grain of salt in a full jabina, or identify which specific tree the beans came from by the aftertaste alone. It's like having a superpower that's only useful for not dying from poisoned beverages. The nose knows before the tongue tastes, Getachew mutters, inhaling the steam with the concentration of a sommelier who's been told there's hemlock in one of the wine barrels. He takes exactly 3 deep sniffs, pausing between each to cleanse his nasal palate with frankincense smoke, because apparently your nose can get confused if you don't reset it properly. The quirky historical detail that nobody talks about. Royal tasters had to abstain from certain foods, garlic, strong cheeses, anything fermented, for days before important tastings. They basically lived on bland porridge and water to keep their palates pristine, which sounds like a terrible trade off for a job where you might die from your morning coffee. The actual tasting moment arrives, and then everyone in the room holds their breath. Getachew takes the smallest possible sip, just enough to coat his tongue, then does this weird swooshing thing that makes him sound like he's gargling air. He's checking for the classic signs of tampering: unusual bitterness, arsenic, metallic notes, various mineral poisons, or excessive sweetness, often used to mask other flavors. But he's also evaluating quality markers that would make modern coffee snobs weep with envy, detecting whether the water temperature was off by more than 2 degrees, if the grinding was uneven, or if someone harbored negative thoughts while brewing. Yeah, apparently that last one leaves a detectable psychic residue in the coffee. I don't make the rules. After what feels like 17 hours, but is probably 30 seconds. Getachew swallows, and everyone waits for him to either nod approval or start convulsing. Today he nods, but adds 17 different critiques about the pour speed, the bean-to-water ratio, and something about the spiritual balance being slightly left-leaning, whatever that means. The coffee is deemed safe but imperfect, which means the brewing team gets to live, but probably won't sleep well, knowing they disappointed the imperial palate. You're taking notes on all of this because next month you start training as a backup taster, which is about as appealing as volunteering to test whether swords are sharp by running into them face first. The political implications of coffee tasting are insane. Getachew tells you about the time he detected poison in the ambassador from a doll's gift of coffee beans, not in the brew, but somehow infused into the actual beans through a process that court magicians still argue about. That little discovery prevented a war and got Getachew a gold chain that he wears like armor, probably because it cost more than most people's houses. Another time, he identified that coffee served at a peace negotiation had been switched with inferior beans, which was taken as such an insult that the negotiations collapsed and 3 provinces ended up in rebellion. When your taste buds can literally start or stop wars, every sip becomes a political statement. Historians still argue whether the elaborate tasting protocols were necessary or just theatrical paranoia, but considering that 3 emperors in the past century died from mysterious stomach ailments after their morning coffee, maybe paranoia was just good sense. Getachew shows you his testing kit, silver spoons that tarnish in the presence of certain poisons, strips of papyrus treated with plant extracts that change color when dipped in contaminated liquids, and a small cage of finches who get to sample the coffee first because apparently birds process toxins faster than humans. It's like CSI, medieval Ethiopia, except with more incense and significantly higher stakes. By the time you leave the tasting chamber, you've developed a new appreciation for your relatively safe job of just grinding beans rather than risking death with every sip. The council chamber buzzes with more intrigue than a beehive that's discovered political science, and you're trying to become invisible while holding a tray of perfectly brewed coffee that might determine whether 3 provinces go to war. Today's gathering includes the Emperor's inner circle, military commanders who look like they eat nails for breakfast, religious leaders whose beards contain enough wisdom to start their own universities, and merchants whose silk robes cost more than your entire village. The coffee you're serving isn't just a beverage, it's liquid diplomacy, and the wrong pour could literally reshape borders. You've been briefed by Almaz that the general from Tigray takes his coffee with extra ginger because it strengthens his resolve, while the Bishop of Gondar requires precisely 7 coffee beans floating on top because of some numerical significance you're too terrified to question. The politics of coffee service follow rules more complex than chess played in 3 dimensions while blindfolded. You must serve in order of rank, but that rank changes based on the day's agenda, recent military victories, who's in favor this week, and apparently the phase of the moon. The master of ceremonies whispers rapid-fire instructions in your ear. The governor first today. He brought tribute. Skip the treasurer. He's under suspicion. Serve the queen mother from her special pot, the blue one with gold trim, not the gold one with blue trim. One wrong move, and you've either insulted someone's honor or accidentally indicated support for the wrong faction in a conflict you didn't even know existed. The mainstream historical fact is that coffee ceremonies were integral to Ethiopian court politics. But what they don't tell you is that entire alliances could form or shatter based on whose coffee was served first, how much foam topped their cup, or whether they were offered a refill before asking. You watch 2 nobles nearly come to blows because one received coffee from a newer Jabina, implying his status was fresh rather than established. The emperor diffuses the situation by ordering coffee served to everyone simultaneously from matching vessels, a diplomatic masterstroke that probably prevented someone from getting stabbed with a ceremonial spoon. Here's where it gets properly Machiavellian. The coffee blends themselves carry coded messages. Serving someone the morning blend in an afternoon session suggests they need to wake up to political realities. The nighttime blend during day court implies someone's ideas belong in the realm of dreams. You accidentally serve a visiting diplomat the guards blend and nearly cause an international incident before Gedeshu smoothly intervenes, claiming it's a special honor blend that shows respect for the diplomat's warrior spirit. The diplomat, who probably knows exactly what happened, accepts the face-saving lie with grace that suggests he's playing political chess while everyone else is still learning checkers. The real drama unfolds when the emperor's cousin, who everyone knows has ambitions that make Macbeth look unambitious, requests his coffee be tested by his own taster rather than Gedeshu. The room temperature drops about 20 degrees as everyone realizes this is basically accusing the emperor of planning to poison his own family. The emperor smiles, and when Ethiopian emperors smile like that, someone's about to have a very bad day, and suggests that perhaps his cousin would prefer to brew his own coffee entirely, to ensure its purity. It's a devastating political countermove that essentially calls the cousin a paranoid coward while maintaining perfect courtesy. The cousin backs down. Gedeshu tastes his coffee with extra theatrical flair, and everyone pretends they didn't just witness an attempted coup get shut down over beverage service. The quirky detail historians miss is that coffee grounds were read like tea leaves after these political sessions. The court fortune teller, a woman who definitely knows which side her bread is buttered on, examines the residue in important guests' cups and makes pronouncements that somehow always support the emperor's current policies. The patterns speak of prosperity through unity, she declares after examining one cup, which conveniently supports the emperor's plan to centralize tax collection. Another cup reveals dangers from the north, justifying the military buildup everyone knows has been planned for months. It's confirmation bias elevated to an art form, but when the fortune teller correctly predicts that the treasurer has been embezzling, probably because she has better spy networks than the actual spies, everyone takes her coffee ground readings very seriously. You're learning that in medieval Ethiopian politics, coffee isn't just fuel for discussion, it's a weapon, a peace treaty, a declaration of war, and a social lubricant, all rolled into one bitter, aromatic package. By the end of the session, you've witnessed 3 alliances form, 2 plots get exposed, and 1 marriage arrangement get negotiated, all while trying not to spill anything on people who could have you executed for staining their robes. The emperor dismisses the court with coffee service, performed in reverse order, a subtle reminder that what goes up must come down, and that today's first pour could be tomorrow's last drop. You retreat to the kitchen, hands shaking from more than just caffeine, wondering how a simple plant from the highlands became the centerpiece of an entire political system. The religious tensions in the palace could power a small city if you could somehow harness passive-aggressive energy and convert it into electricity. You're caught between the Orthodox clergy, who view coffee as a blessed gift from God that should be celebrated with more incense than a cathedral on Easter, and the traditional practitioners who insist coffee beans contain ancestral spirits that need proper consultation before brewing. Then there's the Muslim merchants from the coast who have their own coffee protocols that involve facing Mecca while grinding, which really complicates the workflow when your grinding station faces directly toward what everyone agrees is probably Portugal. The emperor, wisely, has declared that all coffee practices are valid within reason, which is the kind of vague political statement that keeps everyone equally unhappy and therefore balanced. Father Johannes, the palace chaplain, insists on blessing every single bean that enters the royal quarters, which would be fine, except his blessings take approximately forever and involve more holy water than a swimming pool baptism. He's currently sprinkling your morning's batch while reciting prayers in Ge'ez that sound like he's reading the entire Old Testament backwards. Meanwhile, Emabet, the spirit talker, is glaring at him from across the courtyard, clutching her divination bones and muttering about how all this Christian interference is confusing the coffee spirits, and that's why last week's batch tasted slightly off. You're just trying to get through the day without becoming a casualty in a theological war that's been brewing, pun absolutely intended, for longer than anyone can remember. The mainstream historical fact is that coffee played a role in Ethiopian religious life, but historians politely skip over the part where different religious factions basically used coffee preparation as a proxy war for spiritual dominance. The Orthodox Church created elaborate coffee liturgies that required specific psalms for each stage of preparation. Not to be outdone, Traditional practitioners developed their own ceremonies involving coffee divination, where the patterns of grounds and water could predict everything from rainfall to the gender of unborn children. You've seen both sides accidentally sabotage each other's ceremonies, holy water mysteriously appearing in the spirit talker's divination bowls, ancestral herbs somehow finding their way into the priest's incense burners. It's petty, it's childish, and it's been going on for centuries. The really awkward moment comes during the Feast of Timcat, when you're supposed to prepare coffee using both Christian and traditional methods simultaneously. This requires a level of theological gymnastics that would make philosophy professors weep. You start by having Father Johannes bless the beans in the name of the Trinity, then immediately pass them to Emabet, who whispers to them in the old language about their ancestral journey from tree to cup. The grinding must happen while Byzantine hymns play, but the rhythm needs to match traditional coffee work songs. The water gets blessed by the priest and charged with spiritual energy by the practitioner, creating what everyone hopes is double strength holiness, but might just be very confused liquid. Here's the quirky detail that makes you question everything. Both sides are using essentially the same plants in their ceremonies, just calling them different names. The priest's holy basil is the spirit talker's ancestor's breath. The frankincense that fills the Orthodox ceremonies is the same resin used to open spiritual gateways in traditional rites. It's like watching two people argue about whether water is wet while standing in the rain. But pointing this out would probably get you excommunicated by one side and cursed by the other. So you keep your theological observations to yourself and focus on making coffee that's acceptably sacred to everyone. The secret midnight ceremonies are where things get properly weird. Officially, these don't exist. Unofficially, everyone knows that certain palace officials practice coffee divination to make important decisions. You've been recruited to prepare special batches for these sessions, where coffee isn't drunk but used as a scrying medium. The practitioners pour hot coffee into sacred bowls and read the steam patterns, the bubble formations, the way oil separates on the surface. Last week, they apparently saw the face of a future queen in the foam, though when you looked, it just seemed like regular coffee foam having an identity crisis. Still, decisions about trade routes, military campaigns, and royal marriages get made based on these readings, which explains a lot about Ethiopian foreign policy. The Muslim coffee masters have their own approach that's refreshingly straightforward. No spirits, no excessive blessing, just precise attention to cleanliness and timing that aligns with prayer schedules. They've introduced the concept of coffee as a meditative practice, where the repetitive motions of grinding and brewing become a form of moving prayer. This has actually caught on with some of the younger palace staff who are tired of the Christian traditionalist drama and just want to make coffee without risking their immortal souls or ancestral standing. You've learned to switch between all three approaches, depending on who's watching, becoming a sort of caffeinated chameleon who can quote scripture, honor ancestors, and face Mecca without missing a beat in your brewing rhythm. The caravan assembles in pre-dawn darkness like the world's most caffeinated military operation, and you're checking supply lists while trying not to think about the mortality rate for coffee traders heading toward the Red Sea ports. You've been promoted to caravan security, which means you get to carry a spear you barely know how to use while guarding beans worth more than the GDP of small kingdoms. The head trader, a weathered Arab named Hassan, who has more scars than a butcher's cutting board, gives you the cheerful news that last month's caravan lost half its guards to bandits and the other half to what he cryptically calls the coffee curse, which could mean anything from dysentery to actual supernatural intervention. The packing process alone takes 3 days because apparently you can't just throw coffee in bags and hope for the best. Each batch gets wrapped first in banana leaves that have been smoked over specific herbs, then in leather pouches that have been waterproofed with a mixture of beeswax and what Hassan swears is virgin crocodile fat, though you suspect it's probably just regular crocodile fat with better marketing. The loads are distributed among camels, mules, and human porters according to a complex algorithm that factors in animal temperament, terrain difficulty, and astrological considerations. The camel carrying the emperor's personal export blend wears so many protective amulets it looks like a walking jewelry store, jingling with each step like an extremely expensive wind chime. Your route takes you through the Danakil Depression, which is basically Earth's practice run for creating hell. The salt flats stretch endlessly under a sun that seems personally offended by the existence of life, and the only water sources are guarded by Afar tribesmen who view outsiders with the warm hospitality of hungry crocodiles. Hassan negotiates passage with a combination of coffee bribes, silver coins, and what appears to be an elaborate dance routine that might be ancient diplomacy or might just be Hassan having heat stroke. The mainstream historical record mentions these trade routes existed, but they leave out details like how traders had to memorize the locations of hidden water caches, or how certain stretches could only be crossed at night because the daytime heat would literally cook you inside your own skin. The bandit situation is genuinely terrifying. These aren't your romantic highway robbers who might leave you with your life if you cooperate. These are professionals who know exactly how much coffee is worth and have developed extraction methods that would impress tax collectors. You experience your first raid 3 days out from the palace, when men materialize from behind rocks like extremely violent ghosts. Hassan's response is brilliant. He immediately offers them the bandit tribute bags, which contain inferior beans mixed with a mild laxative herb. The bandits, satisfied with their easy score, disappear back into the landscape. Later that night, Hassan chuckles about how those particular bandits will be too busy to bother anyone else for a few days, which is simultaneously clever and terrifying. The quirky historical detail that nobody talks about is the coffee singing. To keep morale up and possibly to ward off evil spirits, opinions differ. The caravan maintains constant songs about coffee. Not drinking songs, these are epic poems about the journey of beans from tree to cup, with verses added by each generation of traders. You learn 16 verses about different ways to die while transporting coffee, which is neither encouraging nor particularly melodic. But the singing serves a practical purpose. It maintains a rhythm for walking, warns wildlife of your approach, and creates an audio signature that lets other caravans know you're legitimate traders rather than raiders. The fact that it slowly drives you insane is apparently just a bonus. Navigation requires skills that make modern GPS look like cheating. Hassan reads the landscape like a book, identifying landmarks that to you just look like rock and another rock, and oh, look, more rocks. He knows which stars to follow, how to read wind patterns in the sand, and most impressively, how to smell water from miles away. He's teaching you to identify the subtle signs of ambush sites, disturbed sand patterns that indicate recent movement, vultures circling areas where they expect future meals, and the complete absence of desert mice, which apparently have better danger sense than humans. You're also learning trader sign language, a complex system of hand signals that can communicate everything from bandits ahead to my camel has digestive issues without alerting potential threats. The really nerve-wracking part is camping. Every night, the caravan forms a defensive circle with the precious coffee at the center, protected by layers of animals, supplies, and increasingly paranoid humans. Guard duty rotates in shifts, and you spend your watches jumping at every sound, which in the desert includes the helpful ambiance of howling jackals, screaming hyenas, and sand making noises that definitely sound like approaching footsteps. Hassan tells cheerful bedtime stories about caravans that relaxed their guard and were found days later as picked clean skeletons surrounding mysteriously vanished coffee supplies. You're starting to understand why coffee traders charge such high prices. It's not just transport costs. It's hazard pay for voluntarily walking through one of Earth's most hostile environments while carrying portable wealth. The preparation for Timcat makes every previous coffee ceremony look like casual rehearsal, and you're part of an army of servants transforming the palace into what can only be described as caffeine-powered heaven on earth. The Emperor has decreed that this year's Epiphany celebration will feature coffee service for over 3,000 guests, which means you're looking at brewing roughly enough coffee to fill a small lake. The logistics alone could break a mathematician's brain. Calculating bean quantities, coordinating roasting schedules so everything's fresh, and ensuring enough holy water is on hand to bless what amounts to a coffee harvest's worth of beans. Master brewers have been arriving from across the empire for weeks, each bringing their regional techniques and closely guarded secrets, turning the palace into a competitive brewing arena where reputation and possibly lives are at stake. The ceremonial jabinas alone require their own warehouse. You're tasked with inspecting and cleaning hundreds of vessels, from tiny cups for children who get a special weak brew mixed with honey and milk, to enormous ceremonial pots that require 4 people to lift when full. Each vessel must be purified with a combination of prayer, smoke, and what appears to be interpretive dance performed by junior priests who clearly didn't expect this to be part of their theological education. The Emperor's personal brewing station is being constructed like a temporary temple, with silk curtains, gold-inlaid grinding stones, and a throne specifically designed to let him oversee the coffee preparation while maintaining proper imperial dignity. The bean selection process reaches new heights of obsessiveness. Representatives from every coffee growing region have brought their finest harvests, and the competition to have your beans chosen for the imperial blend is fiercer than any military campaign. You witness grown men literally weep when their beans are rejected for having insufficient spiritual resonance or troubling undertones of earthiness. The tasting committee, led by Getashu and including every significant coffee master in the empire, spends entire days sampling, arguing, and occasionally coming to blows over whether beans from Sadamo or Harar should dominate this year's blend. The mainstream historical record mentions Timkat as a major religious festival, but they skip the part where coffee politics could make or break regional governors' careers. Here's the organizational nightmare that makes military logistics look simple. Different guests require different coffee preparations based on rank, region, religious affiliation, and whether they're currently in the emperor's favor. You're part of the team creating a master chart that looks like someone tried to map the human genome using coffee beans. Bishops from the north prefer their coffee with ginger and sacred salt. Southern nobles expect cardamom and black pepper. The merchant class gets cinnamon, but absolutely no salt, something about a trade dispute 3 generations ago. Warriors receive an extra strong brew that could probably wake the dead, while scholars get a lighter blend that encourages contemplation without disturbing wisdom. Getting any of this wrong would be like serving bacon at a bar mitzvah, technically possible but socially catastrophic. The practice runs are intense. 3 days before Timkat, the entire coffee service performs a full dress rehearsal, brewing and serving for an audience of palace staff pretending to be dignitaries. You learn the choreographed movements required to serve thousands without collision, specific walking patterns, designated passing zones, and a complex system of hand signals to indicate who needs refills, who's switching to the afternoon blend, and who's had enough coffee to vibrate through solid walls. The timing must be precise. Coffee served too early gets cold, too late, and guests get cranky. And cranky guests at religious festivals have a tendency to interpret poor service as divine disfavor, the quirky detail that would blow modern event planners' minds. The entire service must be performed while maintaining specific sound levels. The grinding must create a rhythmic backdrop without overwhelming conversation. The pouring should produce a pleasant splashing that indicates generosity without suggesting waste. Even the steam from thousands of cups is choreographed, with windows and doors opened in sequence to create visual effects as sunlight hits the rising coffee vapors. It's performance art meets beverage service meets religious ceremony, with a difficulty level that makes Olympic gymnastics look like casual stretching. On Timkat Eve, the palace is electric with anticipation and caffeine. You haven't slept in 2 days, sustained entirely by tester cups and the kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing tomorrow will either be a triumph or a disaster of legendary proportions. The beans are blessed one final time in a ceremony that involves every religious leader who could be rounded up, creating an ecumenical coffee blessing that covers all theological bases. The brewing stations are set like elaborate dominoes, ready to begin a cascade of coffee preparation at the emperor's signal. Your hands shake as you take your position, not from nerves, but from the approximately 17 cups of coffee you've consumed during preparations. Tomorrow, the empire's entire social, political, and religious hierarchy will be expressed through coffee service. No pressure or anything. The moment has arrived, and your heart hammers against your ribs like it's trying to escape before witnessing what happens next. The emperor sits on his portable throne, surrounded by enough ceremonial weaponry to outfit a small army, all of it purely decorative, because the real power move today is in the coffee cup he's about to raise to his lips. You're part of the inner circle of servers, close enough to see the morning light catch the steam rising from the imperial jabina, close enough to notice that even Getashu, veteran of 1,000 tastings, has sweat beading on his forehead. The entire courtyard has fallen silent, 3,000 guests holding their breath, because everyone knows the emperor's first reaction to the Timcat blend will set the tone for the empire's next year. The pouring ceremony begins with mathematical precision. The emperor's cup, gold inlaid with emeralds that probably cost more than most villages, receives exactly 7 pours from exactly 7 inches above, creating a foam that must be neither too thick, suggesting excess, nor too thin, indicating stinginess. The sound of tuffy hitting gold creates a note that the court musicians will later incorporate into commemorative songs, because apparently everything the emperor does becomes art. You watch the liquid settle, its surface reflecting the emperor's face like a caffeinated mirror, and wonder if anyone else notices that His Majesty's hand trembles slightly as he lifts the cup. Even god kings get nervous when 3,000 people are watching them drink coffee. The emperor's first sip is theater of the highest order. He closes his eyes, allowing the coffee to coat his tongue, while every merchant mentally calculates how this will affect bean prices. Every regional governor wonders if their tribute was sufficient, and then every coffee master silently prays to whatever deity might influence imperial taste buds. The pause stretches long enough that you start wondering if maybe Getashu missed something in his tasting, if perhaps this is the moment the empire's coffee culture dies from one bad brew. Then the emperor's eyes open, and he smiles, not the political smile that means someone's about to be executed, but a genuine expression of pleasure that makes the entire courtyard exhale simultaneously. The ancestors smile upon this harvest, he declares, which is code for, this coffee doesn't suck. And suddenly, the festival explodes into motion. Servers swarm like caffeinated locusts. Jabinas appear at every station, and the air fills with the sound of pouring, grinding, and barely suppressed relief. You're assigned to serve the military commanders, which means pouring coffee for men who've killed more people than you've served beverages, all while maintaining perfect form because warriors judge everything as a potential sign of weakness. General Tekla receives his cup and nods approval, though whether he's appreciating the coffee or calculating how many soldiers it would take to conquer the coffee-growing regions is anyone's guess. The mainstream historical fact is that royal approval could make or break regional economies, but the quirky detail is how that approval got communicated. The emperor doesn't just say, "good coffee," and move on. He performs an elaborate tasting dance. Yes, really, where each movement indicates different flavor notes he's detecting. A step to the right means the Sidamo beans are dominant. A hand gesture toward heaven indicates proper blessing integration. A turn to the left suggests the Harar contribution is noted and appreciated. It's like watching interpretive dance meets coffee cupping, and in every movement gets analyzed by observers who'll carry these messages back to their regions faster than any official communication system. The political implications unfold in real time as you serve. The governor of Kaffa, whose beans formed the base of the blend, receives congratulations that border on worship. Meanwhile, the representative from Jimma, whose beans were rejected, maintains a smile that could strip paint while probably planning either agricultural improvements or bloody revenge. You overhear marriage negotiations beginning over coffee service, trade agreements getting sketched out on the backs of blessing scrolls, and at least one territorial dispute getting settled by comparing whose region produced better coffee. It's democracy by beverage, where voting power is measured in aromatic intensity and aftertaste complexity. The really nerve-wracking moment comes when the emperor decides to personally serve coffee to his highest-ranking guests, reversing the normal hierarchy in a display of humility that's actually a power move, so advanced it has its own gravitational field. You're tasked with following him with the ceremonial jabina, trying not to trip over your own feet while the most powerful man in the empire performs barista duties. He serves his mother first, because even emperors know better than to skip mom. Then his generals. Then, in a move that sends whispers rippling through the crowd, a common farmer from Sidamo whose beans earned special recognition. The message is clear. In coffee, excellence transcends class. Of course, after the ceremony, that farmer will go back to his fields and the emperor to his palace. But for this moment, they're united by perfectly roasted beans. The moon hangs like a giant coffee bean in the sky, and you're definitely not supposed to be here, crouched behind a pillar in the palace's most forbidden courtyard, watching ceremonies that officially don't exist. The midnight coffee rituals are where the palace's daylight Christianity takes a hard left turn into practices that would make priests faint and ancestors nod approval. You're here because Emabet, the spirit talker, noticed your receptive aura during last week's grinding session and decided you needed to learn the old ways, the ones that predate churches and emperors and possibly human speech itself. The courtyard is lit only by butter lamps that make everyone's shadows dance like caffeinated spirits, and the air is thick with incense that definitely isn't frankincense. It smells like time itself burning. The participants arrive in silence, wrapped in white cotton that makes them look like extremely serious ghosts. These are palace officials who spend their days spouting orthodox prayers and their nights consulting coffee spirits about everything from military strategy to romantic prospects. The hypocrisy would be funny if it weren't so dangerous. Getting caught here means exile at best, mysterious disappearance at worst. But apparently, the need to divine the future through coffee transcends fear of earthly punishment. You recognize the Minister of Trade, 2 generals, and, holy hell, is that the Empress's personal confessor? The same man who spent yesterday condemning pagan practices is now barefoot in a circle, ready to read fortunes in fermented coffee grounds. The ceremony begins with coffee preparation that breaks every single rule you've learned. The beans aren't roasted fresh. They've been aging in special clay jars buried during the last new moon, developing flavors that conventional coffee wisdom says should be rancid, but instead smell like secrets and rainforest floors. The grinding happens in absolute darkness, the practitioners feeling their way through the process, claiming that sight interferes with the coffee's ability to speak. The rhythm isn't the normal work songs, but something older, a heartbeat pattern that supposedly matches the Earth's own pulse. You find yourself swaying involuntarily, your body responding to rhythms that bypass your brain entirely. Here's the part that makes your Christian-raised sensibilities do backflips. The coffee isn't just brewed, it's awakened. Emabet performs what can only be described as coffee necromancy, calling upon the spirits of every bean's ancestral tree, inviting them to inhabit the brew and share their wisdom. The mainstream historical record mentions that some Ethiopians practiced coffee divination, but they seriously undersell how elaborate these rituals were. Each participant has brought personal items, a warrior's broken spear tip, a merchant's first earned coin, a lover's braided hair, which gets submerged in the coffee to create sympathetic connections. It's like supernatural networking, using caffeine as the medium instead of LinkedIn. The actual divination begins when the coffee is poured into a massive shallow basin made from what Emabet swears is petrified wood from the tree where coffee was first discovered. The surface becomes a black mirror, and participants take turns gazing into it while Emabet interprets the patterns. She sees invasion threats in the steam swirls, accurate, the Adelites are always planning something. Prosperity in the bubble formations, vague enough to be safe, and romance in the oil patterns, probably just telling people what they want to hear. But then she looks into the basin and goes rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites show, and speaks in a voice that doesn't sound entirely human about the emperor's shadow growing short, and beans that will bring tears before joy. The really unsettling part is the ancestral communication segment. Participants drink the coffee, but not to taste, to connect. They claim the aged beans carry messages from deceased relatives, which sounds like grief-induced hallucination until the Minister of Trade starts speaking in his grandmother's voice, complete with her distinctive lisp and tendency to mix proverbs. He delivers a message about hidden gold beneath the old mill that turns out, when investigated later, to be absolutely accurate, whether it's possession, unconscious memory, or something else entirely. You're watching hardened politicians and warriors weep as they receive messages from beyond. The coffee acts as some kind of spiritual telephone, and honestly, the long-distance charges must be astronomical. The ceremony concludes just before dawn with what Emabet calls the forgetting cup, a final serving that supposedly erases the night's revelations from conscious memory while leaving the wisdom in your dreams. You drink, and it tastes like amnesia flavored with cinnamon. As you sneak back to your quarters, the night's events already feel hazy, like trying to remember a dream while awake. But over the coming weeks, you'll find yourself making decisions based on knowledge you can't quite recall acquiring, avoiding dangers you somehow sense coming, and grinding coffee in patterns that feel ancient and necessary. The palace continues its Christian facade during daylight, but now you know that when the moon rises, coffee becomes a bridge between worlds, and some bridges are better left uncrossed unless you're prepared for what might follow you back. Dawn breaks over the Ethiopian highlands one final time in your journey, painting the sky in shades of coffee and gold, and you stand in the same courtyard where this boat all began. Though you're no longer the terrified apprentice who didn't know a coffee cherry from a regular one, the palace is stirring with its usual morning rhythms, servants preparing for another day of ceremonies, the grinding stones already singing their ancient songs, the smoke from roasting fires creating incense spirals that seem to write prayers in the air. But you see it all differently now, understanding the layers of meaning in every gesture, the centuries of tradition in every pore, the political and spiritual weight carried by every single bean. You're preparing what might be your last imperial brew, because tomorrow you leave for the highlands to establish your own coffee house, the emperor's gift for your years of service and, let's be honest, for keeping your mouth shut about certain midnight ceremonies. Your hands move with practiced precision, washing beans in blessed water that no longer seems like superstitious nonsense, but rather a recognition of coffee's sacred journey. You remember that first morning with the Buna Abbat, how his trembling hands seemed like weakness. Now you understand they trembled with the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that every cup connects the drinker to an unbroken chain stretching back to those dancing goats and forward to futures yet unwritten. The roasting process has become meditation for you, as beans transform from green to brown, releasing oils that smell like Earth's autobiography. You think about how Ethiopian coffee culture survived everything: religious upheavals, invasions, attempts to modernize it into submission. The mainstream history books talk about trade routes and cultivation techniques, but they miss the real story: how a people encoded their entire worldview into a beverage, creating rituals so deeply embedded in daily life that conquering armies gave up trying to change them and simply learned to drink coffee the Ethiopian way instead. You've become part of that tradition, another link in a chain that refuses to break. You pour the final brew with movements that have become prayer, muscle memory, and art form all at once. The coffee cascades in an unbroken stream, creating foam patterns that Emabet would read as prophecy, but you simply appreciate as proof of perfect technique. The emperor enters for his morning cup, and you serve him with the quiet confidence of someone who's faced down bandits, navigated court intrigue, and learned that sometimes the most powerful magic is simply doing something perfectly, repeatedly, with intention. He sips, nods his approval, and grants you the traditional blessing for those leaving royal service. May your coffee always foam. May your beans never bitter. May your fire never die. The quirky historical detail that future scholars will probably miss is how personal these relationships with coffee became. You're not just leaving a job, You're leaving beans you've watched grow from flower to cup, grinding stones that know the shape of your hands, jabinas that have learned your pouring rhythm. The other servants gift you beans from their personal stashes, each varietal carrying memories. This one from the batch that survived the bandit raid, that one from the harvest that made the empress smile, another from the midnight ceremony where ancestral voices spoke through steam. It's a library of flavors, each telling stories that no written history will ever capture. As you pack your few belongings, including a small pouch of the Emperor's personal blend, worth more than everything else you own combined, you realize you're carrying more than just coffee knowledge. You've learned that power flows through ceremonies as much as through armies, that the difference between poison and medicine often lies in the blessing spoken over it, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply maintaining tradition in the face of change. The palace's newest coffee apprentice watches you with the same terrified awe you once felt, and you remember being that young, that overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. You want to tell them it gets easier, but that would be a lie. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at dancing with the difficulty. Your last walk through the palace takes you past all the spaces where you've learned, suffered, triumphed, and occasionally questioned your sanity. The grinding hall where your arms learned rhythms that your mind couldn't comprehend. The roasting chambers where smoke became scripture. The tasting room where every sip courted death or glory. The midnight courtyard where coffee revealed itself as a bridge between worlds. Each space holds part of your story now, just as you carry part of theirs. You're not the same person who arrived here years ago, trembling with cold and fear. Coffee has transformed you as surely as fire transforms green beans to brown, and like those beans, you're ready to release your accumulated oils, to share the flavors you've developed through trial and fire and time. The journey back to the highlands will take days, but you're not the same traveler who once feared every shadow might hide bandits. You know the roads now, know which villages welcome coffee traders and which view them as walking gold mines to be harvested. More importantly, you know that what you carry is more than valuable beans. It's knowledge that connects you to every Ethiopian who's ever prayed over a roasting pan, who's ever found the divine in the space between grinding stone and pestle, who's ever understood that coffee isn't just a beverage, but a language, a history, a future brewing one cup at a time. The sun climbs higher, warming your face as you pass through the palace gates for the last time, ready to plant new traditions in ancient soil. As your journey through medieval Ethiopia's coffee culture comes to its quiet close, let the last wisps of incense and coffee smoke drift away from your consciousness. Your breathing naturally slows, matching the gentle rhythm of those ancient grinding stones that now exist only in memory and dreams. The palace sounds fade, the morning prayers, the bubbling jabinas, the whispered political schemes over ceremonial cups, all settling into a peaceful silence that wraps around you like the finest cotton from the highland markets. You've traveled through centuries, witnessed the birth of traditions that would outlive empires, learned secrets that were never written in any chronicle. But now it's time to let those vivid images soften and blur, like coffee grounds settling at the bottom of a cup, leaving only the clear, warm liquid of rest above. Feel the weight of your own body where you lie, no longer carrying precious beans through dangerous mountain passes or standing alert through midnight ceremonies. You're safe in your own time, your own space, where coffee is simple and morning comes without ceremony. Let the stories of emperors and spirits, of perfect roasts and poisoned cups, transform into the gentle narratives of sleep. Your breathing deepens, your mind releases its grip on consciousness, and you drift into dreams that taste faintly of cardamom and possibility. The last ember in the roasting fire goes dark. The final prayer is whispered. The eternal Ethiopian night embraces you, and you sleep.